It's a great day to be scared of heights. Good morning, church. What a beautiful and, just a beautiful and powerful day to be in your presence. Thank you all so much for allowing me the space to share with you today. This the day the Lord hath made, let us rejoice and be glad in it. And I indeed feel glad in it and so grateful to get to spend this Sunday at Myers Park Baptist Church. So thank you all. I'm going to get my sort of technology situation here together. Give me just a second. Awesome. So I haven't been in church in a long time. My parents would say it's because I'm a heathen. But I'm certainly grateful to be in this one today. And I want to talk a little bit, first of all, just about how I got here, because I think it's a sweet story that I talked a little bit about in the workshop that we just had. But about 2 years ago, I had the honor of being asked to write a book, which is about the easiest way to get a book deal in the world is for someone to just show up in your inbox and say, hey, write this thing, which was awesome. And so they asked me to write a book about this work that I do around radical self-love. And I'd been doing it for a while, and I felt ready. I felt like it was time. And so I wrote this book. And the book came out on Valentine's Day of 2018, which is a perfect day for radical self-love. And, I did a 79-day book tour, which I do not advise anyone to do. It was exhausting, and it was amazing. I got an opportunity to see this work around the world and to see what it was doing around the world. So I live currently in Auckland, New Zealand, which is about as far away from Charlotte, North Carolina as you're going to get. And I flew into the U.S. on Wednesday. And so I was in New Zealand at home one day, and at the time I was living on a little island called Waiheke Island, which is about a 40-minute ferry ride from the major city. As you can see, I was trying very hard to get away from humans. I went as far as you could possibly go. And I was in my bedroom, and I decided to Google myself. I advise you to do this every once and again. It's amazing what you find. And I found the Myers Park Baptist Church podcast, Welcome Shalom, or Awakening to Shalom. And I was like, what? A Baptist church is affiliated with my name. These things should not be coming together in this Google search. At which point, I discovered this podcast series that was discussing my book, The Body Is Not an Apology. And as I've told Reverend Ben and as I told Bethany, I listened to it and I felt seen in this incredibly beautiful way. I was like, oh, wait a minute, they got it. These people got what I actually meant. And the connection between our body and the power of loving ourselves and the mandate that I believe that is from God. And how those two things go together to actually change the way that we live in the world. And so I was just delighted and so grateful to have had that happen, and it was a beautiful moment. So I want to talk to you really briefly. Right now, I'm calling this conversation that we're going to have together, what does it mean to reconcile the heart of God against the structures of man? That is what it is that this idea of this conversation of radical self-love for me has brought up. And so I want to talk a little bit about sort of the origin story and then where I see that today in our work in our work to be in right relationship with God, which demands that we be in right relationship with each other. Because it is impossible to be in right relationship with God and in wrong relationship with God's creation. Those two things are not congruent. They are irreconcilable. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we can do that. But I want to start with a little bit about how the body is not an apology, which is the name of the organization I run, how it came into being. Because I think it is a perfect example of getting out of the way so that God can do what God means to do. In spite of you and through you at the same time. So my history is as a performance poet. That was my career for 14 years, which is one of my favorite things back then was to tell people when they asked me, what's your job? Poet. And then to watch the glazed look descend across people's eyeballs as they attempted to reconcile how I could possibly be paying my heating bill with poetry. And it was quite a blessing that I was able to do that. But I used to compete in poetry slam, which is competitive performance poetry. And in competitive performance poetry, you and oftentimes a team will get together and go to a certain city, and you will engage in competition with poems, which is it's such an American game. It's like, let's take this high art form, and then let's turn it into a competitive sport on a reality television show. And so I was actually in Knoxville, Tennessee, at a poetry slam with a group of people who I consider sort of a kaleidoscope of bodies. We were all very different human beings. We were Indo-Caribbean and Pakistani and black and white and gay and straight and all of the above. And I was having a conversation with one of my teammates who at the time was fearful that she might have an unintended pregnancy. And I am historically your nosy friend. I like to say that I will get in your business from a deep place of love. And it is always from a place of love. And what I like to think in that moment is that three things were present in that conversation that made this moment of God through me come through. And that was radical vulnerability, radical honesty, and radical empathy. That I asked my friend from a place of radical empathy. I actually even she hadn't answered yet, but I knew that we probably shared something in common in why she was in the predicament she was in. My question wasn't a question that came from a place of judgment. My question was a question that came from a knowing that I too, that there but for the grace of God go I. And so I asked her why she hadn't used protection with this casual partner. And my friend responded to me in radical honesty, the kind of honesty we rarely give to each other because the stories of shame keep us from telling the truth sometimes. And she said to me, my friend had cerebral palsy, and she said to me, my disability makes it difficult for me to be sexual, so I didn't feel entitled to ask this person to use a condom. And it was such a deep and vulnerable response, and her complete truth. And what got said through me, and I'm very clear that it was through me and not of me, because it wasn't conscious. It just kind of came out like a champagne cork on New Year's Eve. I said, your body is not an apology. It's not something you give to someone to say sorry for my disability. And when I said that to her, we both just started crying. One, because I wasn't saying it to her from a position of hierarchy, from some idea that I had not been where she was. I was saying to her what I also needed to be saying to me at the exact same time. And what got present was all the ways in which I, too, had done that so many times, had decided that my body was an apology and apologized for the ways in which I inhabited the world in a myriad of ways. And because I'm a poet, I was like, that sounds very poetic. That's going to become a poem. And it did. It went on to become a powerful poem that I began to say in the world, in my shows and at events. And because the Word was with God and the Word is God, every time I said that thing, it highlighted either the places where I was in alignment with that word or where I was in discordance with that word, where the word and I were not moving together. And that discomfort is what ultimately caused me to start this organization, The Body Is Not an Apology. It went from that conversation to a poem, from that poem to a Facebook page, from that Facebook page to a movement, to an international company, organization, and book today. And that journey is because what God meant to become of that word required me to notice where I wasn't in alignment. And then to get out of my way, which also meant to get out of God's way so that God could do what God was trying to do through me in that space. One of the questions that came up in our conversation over at the hall was this idea about what sorts of things are in the way of this radical self-love journey that I ask us to be on. And radical self-love, as I define it, really is about how is it that we live into the love that we inherently are, the love that we arrived on this planet as. You came here as love. I'm going to tell you, like I told the folks over there, you have never seen a self-loathing toddler. You've never seen a 3-year-old who hates their thighs. You were a 3-year-old. That is the key part. You were a 3-year-old who didn't hate your thighs, who didn't hate whatever it is about your body that you now think is a problem. That body that grew up into the adult body, that the you in there that was in love with yourself is the same you. It's the same you with a whole lot of layers of other stuff on top of it today. And the work of radical self-love is to peel back those layers that are on top of it so that the you who is the divine creation of God can be fully and unapologetically in the world. And the only way to do that is to figure out, well, what's in between us and who we've always been. And one of the questions that came up in the space was, well, it seems, a woman got up and she said, well, it seems to me that one of the biggest perpetrators of sort of body shame and telling us that we're not good enough has been the church. And I said, touche. And she said, and why do you think that is? And so that is what it is that I've been thinking about in this question of what does it mean to reconcile the heart of God against the structures of man? And in what ways has the church been designed to replicate the structures of man rather than the heart of God? And how do we transform that relationship? And so one of the things that came up for me is this idea in the podcast. They had this great discussion about how do we know a thing, right? And like, what is divine knowledge versus what is natural knowledge? And that oftentimes in theology, we've been taught that divine knowledge is only that which someone else gave us that they said they got from God, right? And that is divine knowledge, and that the thing you know is something else, right? And that we have constructed entire institutions based on the separation of our knowledge from the knowledge that somebody else knows better than us in this institution. And one of the things that I pondered in that question was, well, then, what is divine knowledge? Because I am of the belief in this sort of radical self-love ethos that my divine knowledge is radical self-love. That if radical self-love is my inherent being, that I arrived here as love, and that my arrival here is a divine creation from God, then what I know is from my Creator. That is the knowledge that I've been imbued with. And so, what are the reasons why that knowledge is not considered as valid as other knowledge? And in order to answer that question, we have to think about who benefits from us not believing that that knowledge is valid knowledge. Who benefits from you believing that you are inherently valuable and that all bodies are inherently valuable? And whose power is in jeopardy when we operate in that way? Who becomes at risk? And so this idea really started making me think about this idea of holiness. Because if I'm created in the image of God, and I am God's creation, then is it possible for this vessel that God created to not be holy? And I was on a website, and this website called What Christians Want to Know, which is I don't know anything else about the website except this thing I read, which was describing the biblical understanding of holy and giving me a little bit of the etymology of the word. And it said that the Hebrew word for holy is kodesh, which means apartness, sacredness, or separateness, showing that God is altogether holy, sacred, and set apart from his creation. That the idea that God is totally different from us, which to me just seemed contradictory to the idea that I was created in his image. And so what I wanted to know was, what do we win? What do we get from holding on to this idea of God as completely separate from us and apart from us? Who wins in that theological framework? The person who wins is whoever it is that gets to be the bridge between you and God. That's who wins in the framework where God is separate from you. Right? So whatever person holds the space as intermediary also holds the power. So there is a reason why you are not, in this framework, considered holy. And something about that just didn't feel right with me, so I started looking up scriptures to see, well, what else does God say about holiness? And so in 1 Corinthians 3:16, God says, "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst?" Well, that don't sound like I need an intermediary between me and God. That sounds like I myself, in this being and body today, am the house that holds God and God's wisdom, should I choose to access it. Right? It also said that no one lights, on Luke 8:16, this is the New International Version, no one lights a lamp and hides it in a clay jar or puts it under a bed. Instead, they put it on a stand so that those who come in can see the light. That's not somebody else holding the light for me. That is God asking me to be the light in the world. That don't require an intermediary. That's not somebody in between me and God. That is God saying, I put in you the light I expect you to shine in the world. In Psalms 139, verses 2 through 23 through 24, it says, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." That's not send somebody else to come and search me. That doesn't go and search your neighbor. Right? The request is from me to my Creator. From me directly to my Creator. So if we, and there's one more that I forgot I want to add in here because I was like, yes. Leviticus 20 and 26. You are to be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. God has already told us what our relationship with God is. God has already informed us of what it is that God expects us to be in relationship to the I am. All right? That we already have the relationship it is that we have been asked to have with God. And so a system that tells you that there needs to be something in between you and God must gain something from being in that position. And that is the work of transforming the church from a structure of man back to the heart of God. A structure of man says, you need me in order to do this thing. And we see that again in all of our structures of privilege and power in our world, right? That is what the structure of white saviorism is. You need me in order to do that thing. That's what the structure of ableism is. You need me, disabled person, in order to survive. You need me, whoever it is I believe is less than, in order to survive. But I serve a God that says that our relationship with whatever being it is that we have, whatever vessel it is that we were assigned in this journey, is already reconciled to God, is already arrived here in right relationship. And so whatever is in between that is actually muddying my relationship with God. And so our teachers and our leaders, those that we go to listen to, if they are not talking to us from a position that says, hello, fellow beloved of Christ, all right? Not sinner who needs me to reconcile you, but fellow beloved of Christ. How can I be in relationship with you in a way that brings us both to a greater space of holiness? Both to a greater space of understanding our own divine purpose in this planet. And that as we choose to do that, as we choose to be in right relationship with one another, as we choose to dismantle the hierarchy that says that any of us are closer to God than the other, only then can we actually live into that which we were designed to be, which are unique and powerful and beautiful vessels for love, which is God made manifest in the world. And may the Lord add a blessing to the speaking and thoughts and gifts of his word. Amen.